So the last speaker of the session is David Napier, a professor of medical anthropology at the University College of London and director of its Science, Medicine and Society Network. He's authored several books and articles on resilience, vulnerability and health agency. He co-authored 3 Lancet commissions on climate change and health, stem cells and regenerative medicine, culture and health, and this last one for which he served as the lead author. He specializes in the dynamics of health vulnerability, having developed health assessment strategies and policy protocols in more than 30 countries for the UN, the WHO, and the European Commission, among others. Napier also serves as global academic lead for Cities Changing Diabetes, an initiative working to reverse diabetes and obesity now in over 42 cities. He and his research group are currently working with UNICEF on health vulnerability and standards for measuring community engagement, and as the academic lead with the Economist Impact Unit for its new Health Inclusivity Index, developing for the first time comparable health inclusivity indicators and practices in 40 countries. Today, David will speak to us about his long-standing interest in immunological diversity and complexity.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Napier. Today I'm going to talk about the emergence of the biological self as it relates to its ambient environment, and specifically how this very complex thing called the immune system functions to facilitate and make environmentally viable an emergent human self. In order to do this, I need to spend a few moments looking at the ways in which we've conceptualized the immune system in recent times. And then I want to examine, provided I have time, what this suggests to us about its emergent properties and what they tell us about its ability to either stabilize, to get back to the 2 previous talks, the way they stabilize a newly emergent biological self or destabilize that emergent self. So let me begin with a little bit of history. Okay, I've got the mic here. Am I on here? Can you hear me? Yeah, there we go. Okay, good. Right, I'm not getting my slideshow yet. Don't seem to be having any... do you have my slideshow up there?
On n'a pas en régie votre présentation.
I emailed it last night. They said they did. So.
Not have your presentation.
Sorry.
Sorry.
It was received last night. I got confirmation. All right, let me just talk. I'll just talk for a couple of minutes because I've got my laptop, but that's all right. I don't have to show the slides. I can tell you. Let me just tell you the story, okay? What's that? I can talk to the slides. I'll just do that because otherwise this may take a while. So let's go back to 1960. In 1960, Peter Medawar and McFarlane Burnett received the Nobel Prize in Medicine. They shared that for their understanding of immunity and how immunity actually works. Medawar got the prize because he told us about how mice, that is to say, newly born mice, could actually accommodate difference until they acquired an intolerance for difference. In other words, they acquired the ability to recognize what became to be known as non-self. And indeed, McFarland Burnett got the prize because he actually described this. He described this really quite specifically as the relationship between antibodies and antigens. And of course, what this meant was that for McFarland Burnett, that the antibody itself was actually an antibody is an antigen generator. That is to say, it generates a response to an antigen, and an antigen is an antibody generator. Okay, so the idea here was born, this notion of the immune system being made up of the relationship, on the one hand, of an antigen which generates antibodies, and an antibody, which is an anti-foreign body response system within us, okay? And we hear about this all the time, antigens and antibodies. And this became sort of the foundation of modern immunology, which was defined to me often and repeatedly by theoretical immunologists at the Salk Institute going back into the 90s as the recognition and elimination of non-self. So if you don't have recognition and elimination, you don't have an immune system. And indeed, as we see in all of our responses to COVID-19, we wash our hands. We try to, that is to say, to do whatever we can to eliminate otherness, okay, to protect ourselves from the other. Otherwise, the body becomes a toxic dump site. It becomes basically the residence of all these foreign properties that feed upon us. Now, this was all right. I mean, this went along okay for a while, but it actually had some real challenges associated with it. The first challenge, the complexity challenge, was the so-called evolutionary paradox. In other words, why would our immune system create multiple random forms of diversity if, according to evolution, their inutility would eventually result in their dissolution. That is to say that they would no longer be useful to us. And this is a real problem. I mean, we don't spontaneously create wings just in the event that climate change might flood the Earth. We respond in a much more evolved term, as we've seen in the past two presentations. So this was a problem. And second of all, the second complexity challenge was the size of the so-called immunological repertoire. Now remember, in our immune system, principally our B cells, those are bone marrow cells, and our T cells, our thymus created cells, and our lymph nodes, the lymphocytes, that is to say the white blood cells that diversify this biological information and produce what we call an immune response. This is a very, very, very complex and very unimaginably creative system. So back in the 90s, when I was studying this in 2000s, people would say, well, how many antibodies does your immune system create? And people would typically say, oh, perhaps 10 to the 6th power, maybe 10 to the 16th power. So we're already getting into some massive, massive numbers here. Now, today, the estimate of the human antibody repertoire is actually even much greater than previously thought, with the potential for the body to make a quintillion, that is to say, 1 million trillion unique antibodies if you add these lymphocytes and their variants. Now, this really raises a very significant question, which is, why is your body actually creating this high level of diversity when actually the things that the body could be affected by are much less evidenced to us? And of course, the traditional explanation for this was you're producing novel cells in anticipation of a potential viral threat. That's the self and non-self model of this. But there's another problem here, and that's a third complexity challenge, and that's the question of the life of the virus and what a virus is. And in 2003, I wrote a book called The Age of Immunology, and in that book, I questioned this, how we interpret the immunological repertoire, simply because of the fact that viruses, when you look at them, if you look at what a virus is, it's not like a bacterium. A virus is just a bit of information. It can't reproduce, not without the energy from your living cells. It has no motility, okay? So it has none of the typical indicators of life unless your cells bring life to the virus. Viruses don't invade us. Cell-mediated viruses, we pass them on to one another, for sure. But a virus can sit latent for 1,000 years and have no impact on us whatsoever. It can go into hiding as Ebola. It sits not affecting anyone for a very long period of time, and then it reemerges. So I came up with this argument, which I still stand by, which had long ago seemed rather novel. Today it's fairly common sense to most immunologists in the post-stem cell era, and that is that your immune system actually functions more like a search engine of difference. It's an emergent search engine of difference, okay? It's your body's search engine, and that the viruses are really much more like, what they're more like are they're bits of genetic data. They're like books in a library. They sit there. Some are dog-eared, some get by being read quite a bit, some have dust all over them and are never read. They sit there, billions of them, okay? And we exchange them all the time. So they only have meaning when people get together in reading groups, when they read those books, and they reinterpret them. Right? Those viruses change over time because of the ways in which they enter, and we bring life to them, and they enter our social lives, and we share them. And we know this very simply because of the fact that very lethal viruses like Ebola actually are quite fragile socially, and if you distance people, they basically stop becoming infectious. And it's really the less lethal viruses like COVID-19 that have a resilient social life that make them much more capable of being resilient in social spaces. And I want to emphasize social spaces here because people talked about COVID-19 as a biological threat, but I ask anyone to tell me what we did biologically to address COVID-19 before we had vaccines, aside from treating pneumonia, which is not COVID-19. What did we do? So our entire experience of COVID prior to vaccines was a social one because it was the social actions that we engaged in that actually facilitated its remission or its proliferation. And of course, we tried to, when we did the Lancet Commission on Stem Cells and Regenerative Medicine, we tried to introduce these concepts into mainstream scientific publication, which, of course, they finally made sense because that's what you do with a stem cell, isn't it? The stem is the origin. You go back and find the original version of something and you try to reconstruct it socially. That is to say, you take the life out of the cell and to go back to where it came from, and you try to reconstruct it in a particularly, hopefully, a better and a more effective pathway. Okay, so let me just, I just want to spend another 5 minutes talking about the question of how these ideas about the body and self and other, how they impact our responses to biological emergence. And I want to go back to the February 11th and 12th meeting of WHO in Geneva, which I was present. This was the meeting at which COVID-19 was called for the first time, COVID-19. And I want to talk about a couple of blind spots that I think now have become apparent to us as they relate to our thinking about viruses as infectious agents that require borders to keep us away from them. And I want you to think about, while I'm talking about this, some of the paradoxical things that got people really quite upset about changing policies, about why we had closed our foreign borders to foreigners when we already had COVID-19, and why any of this slowing down actually had much of an impact, except for slowing hospital admissions, which indeed it very productively did. So I'm not saying that the social distancing and lockdowns weren't important. They were, but they weren't necessarily important for the reasons we thought they were. And the first has to do with, the first blind spot has to do with the fact that COVID-19 existed in a number of places we now know around the world at the same time, and before, in fact, the Wuhan outbreak. We had it in Brazil, we have it in Italy, it was founded, so it was around. And the question is, why didn't it not cause an outbreak in those locations? Right? Why didn't it? It's a very, very important question. That wasn't on the minds of, because the whole meeting, and being there, I can tell you, was focusing on how we stopped the Wuhan outbreak. And the Chinese that were really the center of attention of this entire enterprise at the time, rightly because people did not know what to do. But this other issue of the fact that it was already elsewhere but hadn't emerged wasn't part of that conversation. The second had to do with the medicalization of COVID. And of course, I won't go into the details about what we mean by vulnerability, which, as Johan pointed out, is something I've studied for a long time, about the vulnerable populations, which were largely defined in medicalized biological terms: elderly, diabetes, obesity, immunosuppressed, all those things. When in fact, as soon as the virus emerged, we realized that the true vulnerabilities had to do with people living in shared accommodations. You see where I'm getting at, people being close together, people in prisons and so on and so forth, people who had to work, who actually their jobs had to be in the public sector, even medical doctors. That is to say, that the real challenge, the really vulnerable populations, were people who either lived in enclosed spaces, 40% of all deaths in New York City being in care homes and so on and so forth. And in actual fact, the really vulnerable people were people who were in those sectors, much less so than the immunosuppressed elderly person living in a suburban area with health benefits who could just sit out in a chair in the backyard because they had a pension, right? So the question of where the social part of this emerges is really important. And I won't go into details. We did a policy brief for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation on this. And indeed, we stand by our claim that this was a genuine blind spot, as we saw throughout the pandemic, when there were never any mental health people showing up with the virologists and epidemiologists to talk about the public impact of the pandemic. The third one, and in some ways, this one I really find in some ways the most intellectually fascinating, and that is, at the time of this meeting, I'd been working with, I teach, I occasionally give lectures in immunology for the department at UCL, and I've been working with some colleagues there who had been studying noroviruses, the ones that give us stomach upsets and keep us away from work. But they're not necessarily going to cause pandemics, but they are highly infectious, and a lot of us get them, and it makes us miserable throughout the winter. And what they found out was something really, really interesting. They were trying to find out, in terms of vaccine development and distribution, how you identify the sources and drivers of new pandemics. And what they said was, and this is after years of study, and I'm quoting this: "It may be critical to understand that pandemic noroviruses pre-adapt, diversify, and spread worldwide years prior to emergence, strongly indicating that genetic changes are necessary but not sufficient to drive a new pandemic. Instead, they offer the idea that changes in population immunity enable pandemic emergence of a pre-adapted low-level variant." Now, what does this mean in common language? What it means is that there may be several forms of this virus already contagious out there that aren't actually causing pandemics. Several. And so the question here becomes, why does one emerge and why do the others not emerge? And in fact, the noroviruses, they've shown that these viruses are actually infectious 60 years before they actually have an impact on populations. And lo and behold, and I'll end very quickly because I want to point out that this is actually very relevant to what happened in the COVID outbreak, because Actually, the day that I walked away from that meeting, I wrote to a friend of mine who works for the C40 organization. These are the health mayors throughout the world working on climate change and the health impacts of that. And I said that when I walked away from it, I think there's a significant piece of this for C40. I'm just quoting from my email of February 12, 2020, as the real issue has to do with population density and new and emerging megacities. So right then and there, I wrote an article that for Somatosphere, and it was eventually published in May, about this, asking the question of whether the same thing might be true of coronavirus as was true of these noroviruses, that they actually have these pre-adapted forms that actually, for reasons other than zoonotic reasons, jumping barriers, so on and so forth, or the ground zero argument that did this come from the Wuhan Institute for Virology, so on and so forth. And I question whether that orientation, that line of thinking, was actually a good one. And then this didn't go anywhere because virologists don't read anthropology journals any more than most anthropologists read the Journal of Virology, but except for a couple of us. But anyway, the point being that then in September 2021, a very interesting thing happened. I just want to finish with this because I think it tells us a great deal that these scientists from the Pasteur Institute in Paris found that a cave in the mountains of Laos, not far from, actually quite far from Wuhan, but not far from the caves where several of these other bat viruses had been discovered. They found that there, a much closer, in fact, the closest coronavirus to SARS-CoV-2 that had yet to be discovered. Closest. Okay? The closest you got with the Wuhan Institute of Virology was about 1,000 variations, okay, mutations. Right? This is much closer. So it raises the question for the ground zero people was how did it get from here to Wuhan sort of thing, right? But that's not what's happening. Well, that's not what's happening because eventually they realized when they looked at the history of these viruses that both of those viruses had the same, a common ancestor, probably 15, 20, 40, maybe 60 years ago, right? And that the one thing that these two places shared, that is to say, these emergent sites shared, Wuhan and a bat cave, okay, is that these are enclosed, complex, and rapidly recombining environments. Okay, so you have lots of recombinant activity in a very enclosed space that actually gives rise to this. And I wrote a piece for Le Monde in March of this past year called No Ground Zero, but to argue this case. But to conclude, as it relates to this self-emergent question, I think we can end with the question, why have we continued to think about COVID-19 as merely a single biological challenge rather than as a socially, as Steen was pointing out, a socially and complexly mediated set of relationships that together create either widespread disease or well-being? And I think it leaves us with a lot of possibilities, but at least two that are worth considering and discussing. And first one would be because our ideas of what a self is have thus far limited our appreciation of how it is organizationally related to its ambient environment. In other words, to put this in simple terms, what's been the cost of focusing only on this self-non-self relationship and the elimination of non-self, rather than thinking about viruses as actually information that we share socially and that recombine because we share them socially, that is to say, face-to-face, person-to-person. And the second one is, the answer is possibly because we have thus far not succeeded in appreciating the complex interplay between biology, environment, and social values in our attempts to achieve a life fully realized. So I'll just stop there, and I think we can turn it to a conversation. Yeah.